This episode is brought to you in partnership with Econet Wireless Zimbabwe. Hello there, Tando Book Club lovers. This season, we're going on a deep dive with some of Africa's female thought leaders. Joining me today as our guests for a bonus episode special in this series are two authors from the Township Girls collection, Connie Machubaya and Theodora Rondizai. Township Girls is an anthology which comprises the stories of 31 women who grew up in two countries, Zimbabwe prior to independence and Zimbabwe post-1980. The contributors reflect on their childhoods with refreshing candor. Many of their memories retain the crystalline clarity of childhood and thus provide insights into worlds that have often remained unexplored. Behind these women stood dedicated, hard-working parents, often teachers, nurses, or businessmen and women, determined that their children succeed through education. The commitment of this emerging middle class provides us with a tragic reminder of the negative obduracy of the colonial regime, which consistently denied such citizens the right to vote. Nonetheless, we are repeatedly reminded not of the dark side of an essentially racist regime, but of the joys of a secure childhood when parents and communities were steadfast in their values and families consistently offered stability and security. Few will read Township Girls, the crossover generation, without feeling that they have learned something new and been invited into a different world. As is our custom, we always begin every episode with a quote we believe captures the spirit and message of our book discussion. Naturally, we've chosen a quote from Township Girls, and it goes as follows. I am, however, now in my 40s, beginning to appreciate the benefits of my unusual childhood. In retrospect, there was nothing lacking. While I might have been imprisoned in my circumstances, I was also undergoing intensive empowerment training. The simplest things are the most edifying. Reaching back into this enchanted time has provided me with joy and a sense of goodness. Often during very difficult moments when my reason for being became very unclear. I finally realized that I was created with the ability to choose, and I had to exercise this gift wisely. I have finally made my choice. This is from Prologue, Path of Feet, Extremes by Imelda Musariri. Welcome, Connie and Theo.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and why it was so important for you to contribute to this anthology. Theo, why don't you start first?
Thank you, Selina. I was born and bred in Mutare, St. Augustine's, or Kwatambe as it was known, to be precise. We lived there for the first 6 years of my life, and then we moved to Zimbabwe Township, which was where I did most of my growing up. But eventually I moved to Harare to go to school because of the war, when the war was heating up. I became a chemist. I'm an analytical chemist by training. But I always say I spent all of 4 years in a chemistry lab. So I know very little now about chemistry. So today I work with companies that are implementing ISO-based management systems for quality, environment, and occupational health and safety.
Wow, that's very impressive, Theo. Very
Not really.
impressive.
I run a lot of workshops, and I always say that the reason I run workshops is so that I can people watch, because I'm fascinated by human beings.
Awesome. That's really awesome. Connie, what about you?
Well, interestingly enough, just as Theo was born and raised in a small town, I was born in Harare, but I moved to Mutare that Theo left. And interestingly enough, for a season, my father worked with Theo's father. I am a mother of 4 adult children, and we run a family business that has been in existence for the last 24 years. And it's my joy that our children are working alongside us to the point of now even going beyond us.
That's impressive, yeah. And I think that's often a dream many parents desire to fulfill, but not always get to follow through. Why was it so important for you to be a part of Township Girls, the anthology?
For me, Township Girls was something that has always been important in my heart, because as I look at my parents, I have a lot of questions to ask. Not enough time to hear all the stories, no capacity to record their stories. I have stories of my own that I would love my children to hear. And who knows, maybe one day I might have grandchildren. And I would love them to hear the stories even when I'm not there.
Yeah, very, very powerful. It's like that quote from Maya Angelou that we stand as 1,000. We stand with the stories of all of the people that have come before us and their choices, in a sense, that have made it possible for us to be there. But often we sometimes have consider our lives to be quite a solitary and individual experience when it's not really like that at all. Theo, as a participating writer, you were one of the 31 women, and you had your own perspective of what was going on as it was collating. What was your observation of the process of collating all of these stories and putting this book together and then getting it into print and publication?
Well, my own experience was receiving a lot of emails because a lot of the work was done by the three women whose names are on the cover. They compiled it, Nomsa, Farai, and Wadzanai, and they did a lot of work. We never sat down as a group to plan this. It came as a flurry of emails, a lot of emails over the years. And like, ladies, please, can you submit by this deadline? And then an extended deadline. And then there was, for Wadzia, I think it was like herding cats. But it gained momentum. And then we started to realize how important it was and what a privilege it was to be one of those women recording that very unique period in history for us.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, for future generations, as Connie said.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've read the book a couple of times now because we've had other Township girls with us when we were live streaming when we first started, and just such richness and such a unique piece of textured history to give to the nation of Zimbabwe, I believe, and to my generation and the future generations. So well done for doing that. Connie, since the book was published, you must have had different responses, feedback from all kinds of people. What has that been like for you? What has been surprising? What has been edifying about the impact of the book as you've received it through feedback?
Selina, I think what has been interesting for me is that maybe I could say there have been three groups of feedback. The generation of our parents, where they are seeing their world, where they were adults, through the eyes of myself as a child, as I write. And then I've had feedback from my peers, so peer to peer. And then what's been interesting has been for my children to hear stories of the world in which I grew up. And that has, given them so many questions about where I came from. Almost another planet, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it's very interesting. They say that children's observations of their parents are very unique. And when you revisit them as an adult, you sometimes realize you have a little bit of revising and correcting to do of some very hard set opinions you form as a child when you're observing, from that point of view and perspective. But, I found the way that you ended your story really quite special. It touched me because you ended on a musing of wondering how your children will imagine how you grew up and the childhood experiences that have shaped you. And so has this process of putting this down on paper and recording where you came from and what it was like, has it been a really good conversation starter for you and your children in terms of and even your nieces and nephews, in terms of what Zimbabwe is, who we are as a people?
Celine, I'd like to take it a step back and say, for me, just to recollect, to reminisce was, really special. And then from that, the conversations that I've had with my children, with my nephews, with my nieces, as they've read the stories, has been amazing.
Yeah, very,
Yeah.
very powerful. Theo, in your story, there is a really strong theme, it felt to me, of race and racial conflict. And it's quite clever how it comes through, because there's a way in which it's put on display in a very subversive way. So you speak about the dynamics between white girls and black girls at school in that particular era. But then recalling some of the cost that your parents had to pay, moving neighborhoods even, and midnight raids by the police, who were often, white. Always, yes, white. That the conflict is really brutal. It's really in your face. And so we've got this picture of a young Theo experiencing race in her own way, as you're entering these schools and these places. But then your parents are also having a very conflict-driven or conflict-forward experience of the very same issues. Why was this important for you to show this observation and to record this?
I suppose because the memories are seared in my brain, because it was such a part of my childhood. As far as my parents are concerned, when I look back, because a lot of that, like take the midnight raids, for example, I would be standing behind my dad, terrified, and he protected us. But when I think about it now, both my parents were quite a lot younger than I am now, and they had this burden of worrying about their families, their children, and to a very large extent feeling quite powerless, because there were so many things that were out of their control. And perhaps my first experience of that racial conflict that I had to experience without my parents close by was when I moved schools and came to convent for the first time. So yeah, that was definitely a new experience, and so many memorable experiences, events, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And both of you have children, and having experienced race in that way pre-independence, and then experiencing your children born after independence, having a very different conversation with the race, because you end your story and you give us a little picture of the I Love Zimbo t-shirts and this new generation that's coming up almost disconnected or oblivious to kind of that very walking on eggshells experience that was pre-independence for many Black people.
Disconnected, yes. Well, in the sense that they obviously didn't experience the drama of the war that we went through. So, of course, they didn't have that experience. But race still exists, Zimbabwe is a multiracial country. Our children have gone to school with different races. So they've had their own racial dynamics, very different from ours, but still they've had them.
Yeah, very much so. So a question I have for you both, and maybe we can start with Connie here. A cross-cutting theme in all the stories, right, is the idea of two Zimbabwe's, and the generation that was sort of in their formative years, starting to come of age in that late 70s into early 80s period. It's almost like split personalities or a very unique experience, I think, to other generations, right? Do you think now, when we're looking at today's Zimbabweans, so these are the children born in from 2000 onwards, we're looking at maybe even a third Zimbabwe for you as parents of these children or aunts, aunties of these children. And, you know, particularly because there's been so many huge events that have colored their making sense of the world. So there's been if we look just from 2000, there were global events like the Twin Towers being bombed. Then we've all gone through the pandemic, which was like a black swan event, changed the world in a period of 2 years. Now we're even facing even more change with geopolitical tensions all over the world. And so this generation is also, you know, like walking through even a new type of way that people even wore, which was so different to the war that you guys survived. Would you say that there's now a third Zimbabwe that you are living through?
I would say definitely it's a third Zimbabwe, possibly even a different world altogether that this new generation is growing up in. Because when we have these conversations, sometimes I see that our children cannot envisage or picture what I'm trying to tell them was the status quo during the time that we grew up. And even for myself, I often have to keep taking a step back and processing and comparing the world I came from with the world that my children are in. And even more so when I'm with my parents, I then have to highlight to them that no, dearest grandparents, step back. The world has changed 3 times over from your time. So really it is an interesting time.
Yeah. And Theo?
When I look back at my childhood, in spite of the trauma of the war and all of that, my childhood feels very idyllic. It was so, I mean, yes, the war, I mean, when the war intensified, it was terrifying. But prior to that, life was so good. We would just disappear after breakfast and not come home until we were hungry again. Dogs and playing out there, outdoors. Children are not so much outdoors nowadays because of the tech, the TV. We didn't have TVs until I was in grade, I don't know what. But life was so different. And I'm glad I grew up in that era because it feels like it was privileged. So yes, life is very different. I think the thread that runs through these 3 Zimbabweans that you talk about is that Zimbabweans are always having to make a plan. We never seem to have had a period of normal. We are always making a plan and figuring out what to do next in order to survive, in order to protect the ones we love, in order to protect assets even. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But it's interesting to me because, you know, as we talk really crossovers about change, you know, we would say that millennials, those born early 80s, have experienced the most change, but it's actually your generation. Because you can point to a time when you're like, before TV, during landlines, cell phones now, smartphones, you know, internet and witnessing all of that. So it resonates with me when you talk about it as a privilege. But if we look at Zimbabwe, going back to the image or the idea of 3 different Zimbabwe's, are there any aspects of the people, the culture and the nation that have stayed the same, that you can say this is a piece of Zimbabwe that we all know and love, that we should celebrate always, that is unchanging?
I would say the warmth of the people, although somewhat diluted. When you travel in other countries, out there are people who don't greet each other, people who don't look at each other eye to eye. But when you're in Zimbabwe, you can go to the shops, you can go out there, you won't be short of meeting at least 1 or 2 people who will smile at you, who will greet you, or people who you can greet and smile at. And I think that's the one unique thing about Zimbabwe that has remained over time and that makes our country so special.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing, and it's interesting to me that you chose that particular aspect because we've also lived through a time where we've been afraid to breathe the air that is around us, and that's in public. What about you, Theo? What has remained unchanging?
I think change has remained unchanging. We've lived through so much change. I mean, you talked about how our generation lived through the most change. But I was also thinking about reflecting on my parents, because of course they were born in a time where all Black people lived in rural areas, lived in huts and so on, and going to school was like a new thing. I mean, my parents' generation are probably the ones that got educated to beyond primary school level, became professionals, could think about owning cars and homes in urban areas. Those were huge changes. And phones. I mean, my grandparents had no concept of what a phone was. And my parents ended up using cell phones, having TVs. Even I remember my father, who is late now, used to send emails, but he would type them out on his typewriter. And he thought it was essential that he typed out the email address that he was going to give to me to send the email. So those were huge changes as well. But I think I am inclined to agree with what Connie said about the warmth of Zimbabweans. When you come back to Zimbabwe after you've traveled, there's a sense of relief and a settling of the spirit that you feel because of the familiarity of the people, and that you can count on someone talking to you and having a laugh. Zimbabweans have a die-hard sense of humor in spite of everything we've gone through, and I love that about us. We can always find something to laugh about.
Definitely, yeah. You smile,
including
even
at funerals.
Yes, yeah. We do find the most odd places also to smile and laugh.
Yes.
So another question I have for both of you is, in many ways, the book, I think, also reads like a love letter to your parents. In all of the different stories, there's a real honoring of the mothers and fathers of that generation. And I would say the unsung heroes, because these are not the people that went to war. These people fought a different silent war that would have affected them at the core of their personhood, because it was a war against a system that said they were less than and not enough all the time. And yet they fought it also through all of the investment they made in your generation, because they said it will not be like that for our children. Did it just come out that way coincidentally, or is this a deliberate sort of choice in the brief in terms of contributing to the book? Theo?
There was no brief like that at all. I mean, the only brief was we're writing about our experiences of our childhoods during that period. I think it came out because everybody saw their parents as heroes, as the heroes that they were, actually, because of all the sacrifices that they had to make, and living under really difficult circumstances. So yes, that's a thread that runs through, but no, it was not planned. Yeah.
And for you, Connie?
Yes, like Theo has said, there was no brief, but having to write my part of the contribution caused me to step back, to reflect on where I came from, and I can't help it. It is a love letter to my parents, a letter of appreciation. Often people have said, don't celebrate people when they're gone. Celebrate them whilst they're still alive. And it's been special for me to have my parents read my contribution and the contributions of other writers, and see how our generation appreciates them. And because they sacrificed for us, our children's worlds are also different. So it is a love letter.
Yeah, definitely. And
I have a memory, if I can share, when I was a boarder at the convent, and would have parents' days where parents would come and talk to your teachers. My parents were in Mutare, but my father would turn up like clockwork. I knew I would stand outside and I would see him coming through the gate every single parents' day. He would make the trip from Mutare. And that kind of commitment, I mean, my kids were at school in Marondera. I didn't always make it. So they so much that they went through and sacrificed and made sure for our sakes that, yes, they are heroes.
yeah, definitely. Very much so. Even to me, a born free, because I have older sisters who are part of your generation, and so the book was special to me because I could hear their voices in your stories. Looking at my mom, a nurse, and my dad who worked in a bank, and those sorts of experiences. And of course, my older siblings also went to the convent, which most of you who are in the
Yes.
book were either convent or parental girls.
Yes, I know. I know your sisters.
So, how much of that commonality do you think is a generational mindset, particular to, because your generation is what we would call the Gen Xers, and really generations and their differences and distinctions are such a topical issue now, because we are beginning to see that a generation forms a mindset around their worldview in terms of the events that happen during the time they come of age, around 18, but also due to the technology available to them in their childhood. So they've got a very specific idea of even what convenience looks like. But I found it very interesting that it would be coincidental that this common thread would come where you're like, hey, they might not be perfect people, but to me, these people are everything, and I want to honor that. Would you say that that is a theme or a common value that might come up in younger generations? I mean, do you see your children having similar conversations with you, or do you think it's particular to the Gen X mindset?
I think, like Theo pointed out earlier, Gen X is a special generation. I don't think there will ever be any generation like ours. And the aspects of our world that I would wish, our children could experience, values that I would wish they would adopt and embrace as their own. And yet, to be fair to them, their world is different. And I believe as they mature and as we are intentional to impart some of the values that our parents passed on to us, they will somehow carry a thread of where we've come from.
Yeah, in their own way.
In their own way,
to
definitely.
them. I also sometimes wonder, I think, each generation just has their own way of giving the nod to the generation before. But just to turn the conversation towards a different aspect, but still on this issue of generations, the book is by women and about girls. And in a sense, girls becoming women or girls finding themselves. How important is this type of storytelling for the girl child in today's world? Seeing a book where 31 women tell their story, and as a girl making your way in Zimbabwe, accessing that kind of a publication, what would be of value there?
Selina, allow me to borrow a couple of phrases from my mother tongue. And notice I say mother, showing the value of a woman. In Shona, they say, Mwana ndimai, a child is the mother. Musha mukadzi, a home is the woman. So this storytelling is very important to me, to us, because I believe that we have that role as women, as mothers. Generally, we tend to be the primary caregivers of children, the next generation. So as we tell our stories, we pass on some of those values that way. And the girl child, as they read and embrace our stories, they also have an opportunity to borrow something from us and take it to their world as much as we have borrowed from our mothers. You know, our mothers have shaped us. We are proud of them. We have no words to ever say thank you enough to them. So this is important for the girl child. But of course, not to segregate the boy child. It's also important for them.
Yeah, definitely. I do think it's important for young boys to also be able to see a publication of this kind written and produced by women, and talking about those female experiences. In many of the pieces, different writers celebrate grandmothers of their own, telling stories, orally in the house and passing, those sorts of ideas on to them. So very, very powerful. But also education is a strong theme. What you celebrate in celebrating and honoring your parents is also the investment in education, because for your generation, it was still a little bit taboo for girls to be even sent to schools like Convent and Arundel as they were opening up. It was not seen as a good investment. What do you have to say to that, Theo, when you're also looking at a generation of young girls coming up who might be taking education for granted?
Yes, definitely you are right. We grew up at a time when it wasn't seen as particularly important to send girls to school. I was very lucky. My parents never ever saw it that way, or never ever portrayed any of that kind of thought. So it was assumed you went to school, you did your O levels, you did your A levels, you went to university, you went as far as you possibly could. And there was no difference in terms of the attitude towards boys and girls. But certainly I had peers who stopped school after grade 7 and got married a few years later. People I went to school with. And that is heartbreaking to me, because the trajectory of their lives became very, very different. I'm very glad that we look at things differently now, and that this younger generation looks at it differently. But it also makes me extremely sad to find that you still find pockets of girls not going to school, being married off very young. That is truly, truly heartbreaking that still happens in 2024. Yeah. But yes, I mean, nobody should take education for granted. Our parents made all those sacrifices because they saw that as our ticket to freedom. Yeah. So it couldn't be compromised.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the book is such a wonderful demonstration of saying, like, look, it paid off.
Yeah.
Because, the book has so many lives. It can take and so much impact beyond your lives. Because you spoke about earlier your grandchildren being able to access your story and a piece of you through recording it in this book. As we're starting to wind down this episode, Theo, after the book came out, did you find, as you were reading through other people's stories, because I suppose on the way there, it's about the deadline. You've got to get your story in, right? You got to appease what's an eye. And then afterwards, the book is published, right? And now you are having a different relationship with the book, and now it's a different journey, because it's no longer, your little group of 31. It's now in the world.
There.
Yeah, it's living its own life. Did you get a chance to go through the other stories? Were the other stories that you were like, oh, this is nice? And if there were, is there one that was a particular favorite for you?
I wouldn't pick one as a particular favorite, but there were certainly bits of other people's stories that really struck me, possibly because there was some resonance, or possibly because they were funny. I recall, I think it's Tsitsi Sopotsa, who talks about when most of us had the experience of moving from the townships to the suburbs, that transition. And when her family moved to the suburbs, she was so excited that she was going to have white friends. And she was imagining herself making friends with the little blonde girls next door. And she was rehearsing how she was going to meet them, etc., etc. then she saw the neighbor, the white neighbor, putting up a screen so that they couldn't see their porch. I mean, that rejection, can you imagine that kind of rejection for I don't know how old she was, but she was obviously a little girl. And you don't expect that, and you're confused. And I could identify with it somewhat, because I remember when we moved to the suburbs, I was already a boarder at the convent, but I came home for the school holidays and I had a book of raffle tickets to sell. And so I went around the neighborhood I mean, all the neighbors were white at that time. I walked up to a gate where there were white people behind the gate, but it was a fence. They could see me. They didn't have the high walls. They could see me. And I could see the white lady gesticulating and telling her garden boy, gardener, but garden boy was the term used, to get rid of me. And and I was, I would be confused, but we got it because we were surrounded by it. So,
Yeah. So also I think a catharsis and like, okay, so it was happening to you too. And I think an opportunity to finally say it out loud, that it happened.
Yeah, exactly. And also finding that we had all had very similar experiences.
Yeah. Very powerful. Connie, for you, have you kind of got the writing bug since doing that one essay for this book? And would we be looking to future publications from you? Is this something that you would do again? Or is it just, it was enough for this? It was this particular story that had to be told and it was enough?
Selina, I loved writing essays during my time in school. I loved to write poetry. I believe I used to write interesting stories. But somehow when it got to the contribution for this, like Theo said earlier, for Wadzi, it was like herding cats. She had to prod me. And I'm so glad that she was that strong, because she then brought back something in me, which I thought was gone. And I'm seeing one of my daughters actually starting to do blogs and making money out of it. So besides making money, I think I'm ready to try and write a bit more myself now.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I think you both wrote very well. There's some incredibly good writing in the book. And when you introduce yourselves to us, you're doing these other jobs that are very different and far from that kind of life. But there was incredibly good storytelling in the book. So if you do publish going forward, we'd be very keen to review those books here on the book club. A final question for you both. The quote I read at the beginning of the book was from one of the contributors that didn't make it to publication. She unfortunately passed away before the book was published, and her name was Imelda Musariri. And I know that it's important for you as a group to keep that memory burning, so to speak. And at different interviews that I've observed on different platforms, somebody always says something about Imelda. So who was Imelda to you? And the experience of losing someone on the way to publication, what was that like for you?
I didn't know Imelda personally, but I do know a couple of her younger sisters. Keeping her memories alive is important because, she grew up in our generation. And whilst we mourn her departure, I'm just so thankful that, her publication, her stories are still alive, not only for now, but for future generations.
Yeah. Very, very powerful. Theo, anything you'd like to share?
I also never met Imelda because, of course, I was a Mutare girl and she was in Harare, but we had friends in common. So I used to hear about Imelda, and apparently she was very beautiful. Yes, and her story is very lyrical. Her language, I love the way she expresses herself. She also became, because she passed away in 2014, which was some years before we published, and dedicating it to her memory, it became like a driving force to get it done, because I think we lagged. Yes, because of the herding cats, as you said. So it became motivation to get it done, and I think we can thank her for that.
Yeah,
Because she provided her passing provided focus. Yeah.
I'm also glad that we got to have her story. Like you said, she does have a very lyrical way of writing, but in her story, she even talks about the process of sort of getting herself together to write.
She'd always wanted to write and put it off.
Yeah,
yes.
and
so I'm
put
so
it off,
happy that she did write that.
So in a way, a dream fulfilled. So that's very rewarding and edifying. But we're coming towards the end of our episode. And before I ask you to read, can you just give us an idea of your insights into what the publishing industry is like in Zimbabwe? Because this book was self-published to a particular point, and then you brought in a very renowned publisher that's since closed down to help you, do the home straight and the final crossover. What were your impressions of the publishing process and the industry?
That it's hard. That it's hard. There was so much going back and forth. I mean, of course, I had zero experience of the publishing industry until we were publishing this book. And I learned how much is involved and how much we had to thank the people that did the editing, designing the book cover. There's so much that is involved. And of course, Irene Staunton, God bless her, she did so much work to get it out there. And it's still going on. I mean, all that I did was pitch up when there were events to promote the book, respond when somebody says, come for an interview. So that's how I played my part. Because I mean, I have no skills related to publishing. But I take my hat off to authors who work hard to get published, because it's certainly not a cakewalk.
Definitely, it's not. Yeah, and particularly in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and it's really important that we allow our authors to have a last word on the book club. And so we always ask for a reading. So I've asked you both to do a short reading. So Connie, would you kick us off with your reading from the book?
Certainly. Thank you, Selina. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my contribution. And my contribution is called, Please Send Me Chocolates. That was what my idyllic life was all about. As I was growing up, I was in boarding. So here we go. 1967, David Dawanyi, a high school mathematics teacher at Highfield Secondary School, married Christina Chopera, a trainee nurse at Harare Hospital, known as Pagomo. They had a customary marriage, followed by a white wedding. In June 1967, they welcomed their first son, Tendai Edward Dawanyi, into the world. A few years later, while still at their home in Highfields, Salisbury, they welcomed their daughter, Nomusa Constance Dawanyi, that's me, into the family. In 1977, the family had a last son, Tinashe David Dawanyi. By the time I was born, my mother, Christina Dawanyi, had left her nursing career to become a social worker in Kambuzuma. As a result, once I was ready for preschool, I attended Kambuzuma Creche. Having aspirations for their young family, my parents then sent my older brother and I to St. Martin's Convent School for my KG1, the first year of school, otherwise known as Kindergarten 1. This was 1977. At the time, my dad received a promotion from being a secondary school teacher he became an education officer. His assignment was to the Ministry of Education in Amtali, which is now Mutare, to oversee schools in the Manicaland area, which also covered Buhera. I did not know it then, but this was the time of war in Rhodesia. So my parents were not keen to move my brother and I to Mutare. So we lived for a year with my mother's younger sister, her husband, and family. They moved into our family home, while my parents moved to Sakuva, a high-density area in Mutare, with my baby brother. Mr. Chiweshe, who lived in the neighborhood, had a minibus. He would pick up my brother and I at the gate every morning and take us, as well as other children, to St. Martin's School. And at the end of the day, he would bring us home. We would carry our school bags, and in them, besides our books, would be polony sandwiches and a 1-liter juice bottle filled with raspberry squash. Friday after school was one of my favorite days. We would stop at a small shop in Adbeni, where I remember having enough pocket money to buy a huge, brightly colored dummy, a sweet that I would enjoy for many happy hours. On days when we were not at school, I remember the sweet sound of the snowman, a blue and orange soft serve ice cream van.
Thank you, Connie. Very
Thank you.
idyllic pictures there. Theo?
Okay, I'll need my glasses. So I'll read an extract from when we were living in Zimunya before I went. This was about a year before I moved to the convent. So I was at school at Zimunya Primary School, but then so this is where it begins. Within a few years, both my older siblings were in mission boarding schools. Many children were sent to mission boarding schools for high school. There, the focus was on academics, and they encouraged independence. I would be consumed with envy as my brother and sister packed their trunks and tuck boxes. It seemed to me a very grown-up thing to do, and I desperately wanted in. In grade 6, at my insistence, I was sent to Hartsel School at Oldham Tali Mission. Sadly, the reality did not match my expectations. The food was limited and unappealing, and the ablutions were a daily nightmare. One event, although comical in retrospect, did little to help me settle in. During my last term at Zimunya, aged 11, I had entered an essay competition administered by the Rhodesian Army. It must have been a feeble attempt at public relations as the Liberation War was heating up. As luck would have it, I won first prize, and an army truck with a couple of white army officers dressed in camouflage fatigues, no less, duly showed up at Hartsel asking for me. An impromptu presentation of a brand new FM radio followed. That was my prize. Pictures were taken, apparently for the Amtali Post. Of course, this made me look bad. And word soon spread of my selling out to the enemy. That night, a large group of furious girls descended on me, demanding an explanation. I narrowly escaped a beating. Soon, I was writing dramatic letters home, peppered with hyperbole about my suffering and begging to be rescued. I conceded that this life was for girls made of sterner stuff. So the following term, I found myself back at Zimunya School, subdued but quietly relieved.
That's a wonderful, wonderful little piece from your story as well, and very striking. So it's been another great edition of the book club as we talk to Township girls, Connie, Machubaya, and Theo Rondizai. See you again next week, same time, as we celebrate another fabulous African female author. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, and stay true. Goodbye. This episode was brought to you in partnership with Econet Wireless Zimbabwe.